mostly because I grew up in Northern Ontario and it's rare to see it mentioned on the internet at all. I was shocked to read a post by someone which detailed their experiences on a camping trip around the area I'm from. I'd read the post simply out of curiosity, but some of the things written in it stood out to me. When I investigated the comments and found that the author was describing the exact area at which I grew up, I certainly hadn't expected that. Ontario is gigantic, what are the odds? My blood ran cold. First, I think I should provide some background. As I said above, Northern Ontario constitutes a large area of Canada, and even of Ontario. Besides this, it is sparsely populated. The towns are small, few and far between, linked only by the large Trans-Canada Highway. In between them, long swaths of dense, dark forest. Maybe a few trails for skiing, but largely uninhabited. I grew up near these forests, but didn't really venture into them too much until my dad bought a large property when I was about 10. The property was gigantic, about 500 acres, dirt cheap, and mostly forest or exposed rock that so characterizes the Canadian Shield landscape. Someone there had owned horses, so there were 2 very overgrown fields, grass up past your head, and a couple chicken coops. He even had some trails running through part of it, from the house to a large river that we could go swimming in, to an old abandoned mine shaft, and connected to the backs of other properties. Despite the worry of bears, and I can't count how many bears I've come across living there, I hike these trails nearly daily. I've always loved the outdoors. There is nothing I like better than being alone in the middle of nowhere, not another human in sight. Of course, I brought my dog Rudy with me for safety. He's an expert bear chaser. Mostly these walks were uneventful. I would get to the river, take a swim, and head back home. The walk there and back took about 2 hours. The creepiest part was probably the last leg up to the river. You would break out of the forest to some rolling plains which were bare due to the large power lines up. You would then take the trail along these hills parallel to the forest until you reached the water. There was a loud droning hum in the air the entire way due to the power lines. Besides that, complete silence except for my own voice. I always sang on the trails. It was a good way to warn bears away from you. The thing about bears is that they don't usually want to fight you or even be near you. If you give them a good warning that you're approaching, they usually clear out. Some people play radios. I would sing. The first thing that I can remember happening was that I was walking along the hill path, singing like I always did, and the droning behind my voice was broken by a weird bleeding sound. Rudy took off running towards it immediately, so I followed him cautiously. Thought it might be a deer or something, so I was intrigued. For how large the property was, I never really saw a deer on it except once, which I'm getting to, so I was curious. When I caught up to Rudy, he was cornering the path next to the woods, barking furiously. I hung back a couple yards because it immediately became apparent to me that this was not a deer. I couldn't see what it was, but I could see the bush thrashing wildly, the tree branches swinging low to the ground. Whatever it was, Rudy had frightened it back into the cover, but the size of the animal required to make that large of a racket had me suspecting a bear. It wasn't retreating, but I wasn't about to continue forward, so I turned around and headed home. The next day I was in the house, and it was near twilight. I had an unspoken rule. I never went outside after dark. You'd be stupid to. Everyone has stories about relatives attacked by coyotes after dark, or coming in between an aggressive bear and your garbage can, so I stayed inside. I was on my balcony reading when my brother pointed out something in the fields to me. The fact that we could see this thing at all was amazing. The grass on the field was high due to years of neglect, but there it was. This massive buck. He looked enormous, at least 8 feet tall. We thought it might be a moose at first, but the face was far too delicate looking and there was no mistaking those giant, sharp antlers. He stood in the field, gazing at the house, not moving as the sky darkened. Must have left in the night. My brother was angry the next morning. He was woken up several times during the night. Rudy had been barking at something. He reported hearing an odd noise, but it was mostly just mad at the dog. I didn't think anything much of it. We thought maybe he had chased away the deer or something. Inspection of the chicken coops when we went to feed them before school revealed that some of our hens were missing. We found the feathery remains of them a yard or so away from the coop on the edge of the horse field. Maybe Rudy had been chasing away raccoons or foxes instead. I don't know when this happened, but it was sometime after. On our way home from school, the bus dropped us off at the edge of the highway and we would have a long walk home down the driveway. We looked down the side of the path and saw something about 200 meters away. I went to see my brother last week and brought it up with him because it had been on my mind since I read that post. I asked him if he remembered the time we were walking from the bus and saw something. He said yes, laughed a bit, and I asked him to describe it.
It was tall, white, on 2 feet.
He said. See, I thought so too. I remember it being on 4 feet at first and then standing up until it was on 2. I remember it was white.
It was white, Looked like a deer.
Then we saw it. Must have seen us because it just walked away into the woods on 2 feet.
I don't know what it was, though.
Did you ever see it again?
No.
I had, though. For a while, I kept hearing that weird bleeding sound at night, and our chickens kept disappearing. Then our ducks went, even though they were locked into the coop at night. Then the feral cat colony in the barn started being picked off a couple at a time. I dreamt about a messed up animal once around that time. It was an animal that began as a crane, flying low to the ground, and morphed into a decaying, centaur-like creature as it stumbled to the ground for flight. It shape-shifted, tumorous and bruised. It was screaming in that bleating voice, almost like a human but not quite, sniffed the air blindly, charged at me. I woke up just as it touched me. I don't know what it was. Maybe I was just upset by the cats disappearing and her livestock going, and I had a nightmare about it. Maybe it was nothing. I'm not here to say any of that was somehow supernatural. Just that it happened, and that it was weird. Eventually, we stopped hearing the bleeding noises at night. I stopped hiking. I moved away to go to school. When my boyfriend and I visited my dad at his property and took him for a walk, he said the place gave him the heebie-jeebies. Why?
This feels like prime Wendigo country.
What the hell is a Wendigo? I'll tell you what a Wendigo is now that I know. Back in the day, if a community became cut off from food, they might resort to cannibalism in order to survive. But it caused madness. It was also called Wendigo sickness. Was it only a legend created to explain these people who would resort to eating family and friends? A Wendigo is a witch. Ojibwe, as many indigenous people have a legend about Wendigos. It is a witch. It was a person that desired power so badly that they paid a terrible price for the ability of shape-shifting and immortality. They became mad with corruption, and they are always hungry and feed on anything, but above all else, they are cannibals. They are so old and wretched that they look like zombies in their real form, graying skin, necrosis, bloated bellies from gorging themselves on any flesh they can find. Wendigos are pure greed and hunger. They can shapeshift, they can turn into a person, into an animal. A master of a Wendigo can imitate a human voice, or babies crying to lure you, get you lost in the woods, and they strike. They can infiltrate a group and pick you off one by one. They mostly hunt at night. You are never supposed to whistle at night because it attracts bad spirits, Wendigos included. Northern Ontario is unceded Indigenous land. Upon further investigation, I realized my boyfriend was right. This is prime Wendigo country. I had been so preoccupied with singing to keep away the bears that I never thought about what I might be luring home with me.